We are going to discuss through the arc of the rainforest in this lecture. So to begin, let's talk about the idea of a literary grotesque. So what is a literary grotesque? Well, they are characters who evoke both attraction and repulsion and who are defined by oversized or unusual characteristics. So we can certainly think about this in terms of through the arc of the rainforest. Where do we see this? Well, almost every single character has a literary grotesque. So if you think of J.B. Tweep, he has three arms, right? And so he has something that is oversized or unusual, or the floating orb, right? So that's a characteristic of a character that's obviously oversized and unusual, and is also an important plot point in the book. And this idea that it evokes both attraction and repulsion. So especially if you think of J.B. Tweep, the idea of having three arms might immediately kind of evoke repulsion, but at the same time, the character can be quite charismatic, can be funny, can almost be sweet at times, which is interesting because he's also destroying the earth essentially on his own with his business. And so there's very interesting literary moments happening with both the literary grotesques, how they impact the character, but then what that means for the story and what that might mean in terms of metaphor and what we take away from the novel. So what does it mean that we're both attracted and repulsed by J.B. Tweep? And what does that mean about how we think about extraction, corporation, business? Are we attracted and repulsed by it? Is it oversized and unusual? There's lots of different takeaways. And so we could analyze each character and their literary grotesque. And keep in mind that this doesn't necessarily mean that it's a physical feature. Oftentimes it is a physical feature. So a writer like Charles Dickens was very famous for this because he had many, many characters in his novels. So he would often use literary grotesques as a way to define a personality. So if someone had just really bad teeth, for example, you knew that character was bad. But if they had really soft eyes, you knew that character was sweet or sensitive. And so he was very famous for these literary grotesques that he would mention over and over again. But it was also a way to keep track of the characters in the novel because he had so many. But a literary grotesque doesn't have to be physical either. So it could be something like being obsessed with pigeons. And that could be the characteristic that is oversized or unusual and is a commentary on something in the book. So if we think about this in terms of the novel, we have so many different issues at play in the novel. In fact, it's a book that is so ripe with meaning that I feel like you could analyze it for weeks and weeks and weeks. Like you could take a whole class on just this book because it's touching on so many issues. Environmental degradation, post-colonialism, capitalism, extraction, colonialism, Western imperialism, ethnocentrism. I mean, I could go on and on and on about the issues that this book is touching on in this kind of literary grotesque way. It's using these characters who are very funny, who are very silly, who have these unusual characteristics, who have these unusual jobs, who have these unusual passions. And although they're all not real, they're magical realism, right? They do speak to a lot of very real concerns. So a lot of them are just substitutes for real things that are happening in our world. And so I wanted to take a look at these pages 144 to 145 in particular, because this is where we begin to see some of the kind of direct implications of the storyline on real life. So although we are going to be talking about things in the book, storylines in the book, characters, you can hear, especially in these parts, the direct correlation to real life issues. So I'm going to start at the bottom at 144 and just read to the top, although the entire 2 pages, again, ripe with meaning. In this great task of combing through the countryside for Matiko plastic, JB, with his usual thoroughness, sent Kazumasa and me out with a team of specialists, their assistants and their gophers, to map out entire areas, every road, every railway, every waterway, every path through, by, under, and over. We must walk, swim, ride, float, or hover, leaving no piece of that portion of earth unknown to me, the ball. In this, JB was ruthless in his expectations, weaving and tossing GGG's net farther and farther, oblivious to any obstacles in our paths. Acres of flooded forest, dolphins leaping into the canopy, giant parachute waiting in the shallows for dropping fruit, great government hydroelectric dam projects, hundreds of species of plant and animal life bulldozed under, rotting and stinking for miles in every direction, Indian homelands, their populations decimated by influenza. Kazumasa saw, smelled, felt, and tasted everything. He saw the beauty of the land, smelled the stink of its decomposition, felt the heat of the great forest fires, tasted the sweat of human labor, and still we moved on, searching for plastic. So in this paragraph, we're talking about a not real scenario, right? The Matiko plastic. However, it touches on so many actually real issues that are part of environmental catastrophe, environmental degradation, colonialism, and the effects of colonialism, the genocide of Native Americans, American Indians. So we're seeing all of this happening in this paragraph. And even though it's fictional magical realism, of course, the correlations are very, very real. And that's something that magical realism can accomplish really well by using these fantastical situations and these fantastical characters. We can almost see the correlations to real life more clearly than if it was actually nonfiction. In some ways, it makes it more obvious, and also reflects back to us some of the absurdity of human behavior. And so we see that here in this paragraph, although we see it in many places in the book. But this goes back to this idea then of climate fiction, right? So it's talking about this real issue of climate that has real correlates, but it's fiction. And so putting those 2 items together, climate and fiction, what do we get from it that we may not have gotten if we say, just read an article about climate change? So what is the literary text? What are these characters doing? What are these storylines doing for us as the readers that help us understand the issues more clearly, even though it's fiction? So that's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of both magical realism and climate fiction. Okay, so let's talk about some final ideas that are connected to what we're talking about with both the literary grotesques, but also with just the metaphors and magical realism in general. What are we accomplishing with a book like this? Or I should say, what is the author accomplishing? So I think it's important to not necessarily always assume there is a direct correlate with everything in the book. I mean, things can be symbolic, they can be derivative, they can speak to issues, but there might not always be an exact correlate. But sometimes I think there are. So an example is, what corporation could GGG be a metaphor for? I personally really like the scenes about GGG. I like the kind of making fun of corporation and the silliness of the corporate world. I always found those passages to be really funny. Do you think that's a metaphor for any business? So we know that GGG is, of course, incredibly exploitive. They're also a stand-in for being very politically correct. They say all the right things. They say they're environmentally friendly. They say they care about the environment, even though at the same time, they're the ones that are exploiting the environment. So Are there any correlates to that in the modern world? How might the feather business be a metaphor for the extraction of goods? This is another one of those magical realism qualities that is really funny at times, but also really sad. We hear passages about these feathers and the obsession and the addiction just decimating communities. And of course, we see correlates like drug addiction and things like that. Where people say, well, the item, the resource, or whatever it was taken out of its original context. That's not how it was meant to be used, but it's being used that way. And so, is the feather business a correlate for anything else? How does the story of Modicco plastic reflect society's use of goods? And then, what other metaphors, relationships, or symbols do you see in the text? Again, this novel's absolutely ripe with it. So it's something interesting to be thinking about as you finish up the novel. So I hope you enjoy the last pages, and really in the enjoyment also see what this novel is leading you to think about a little bit more.